Deion Sanders and Colorado are looking to contend, and it's going to be because of their transfer portal class. But how good is that transfer portal class?
You are Locked On Buffs, your daily podcast on the Colorado Buffaloes, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to Locked On Buffs. I am your host, Kevin Borba. Today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. We are also brought to you by the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team every day for free and available wherever you get your podcast. And who doesn't love free things? And who doesn't love PFF's Dalton Wasserman? Dalton, how are you doing?
Doing fantastic. Appreciate you having me on. It's always fun to talk about the lightning rod that is Deion and Shedeur and the Colorado Buffaloes right now, man. You know, they didn't have the year they thought they were going to have last year, maybe fully, but they are the most fun team in college football to talk about, aren't they?
Yeah, they're an exciting bunch. It's hard not to be excited about them because they do everything so differently. Whether you love it or you hate it, they're drawing your eyes to it. And I think that kind of has been an overlaying theme with Colorado over the past year or so, because even fans from around the country are dialing in to watch them play Colorado State or to watch them play Stanford. And it's really bizarre because I don't feel like we've seen a team or the program this random draw this much attention. But here we are talking about Colorado, full excitement before the season. So let's talk about what's their moneymaker. Obviously, Coach Prime goes into the transfer portal last year, brings in over 50 guys. They had the number one ranked class, depending on what recruiting service you use. And I want to say the class didn't work out. I don't think it worked out how he hoped, and I would say he'd probably agree with that. A lot of those guys that he brought in didn't really stick. They didn't really make the impact that they wanted. There's a handful of guys. I'm not going to pretend Xavier Weaver wasn't a star. Shedeur Sanders, obviously, Travis, Shiloh. But a lot of the guys didn't really work out. This year, you look at the class, top 10 class again, but there's a big difference. Talk to me about what this transfer portal class, why it stands out to you and what you expect.
Yeah, so I think first is you have the perspective of in 2022, they were the worst team in the Power Five. So I do think it did work to an extent of getting attention, building a culture, and winning a few more games. Maybe not as many as they'd hope. Maybe you'd at least like to have gotten to a bowl game. But things happen right when you're building a program. But the big thing is doing things consistently over time. And what Deion's proven is he's going to slam the transfer portal, right? And this year, I think he may have done an even better job than last year, because a lot of last year was the focus on bringing the guys from Jackson State with him and all of that. But I'll tell you what, they've got a loaded crew coming in this transfer portal. I believe On3 had it as the second best portal class in the country. Some outlets have it number one, but some guys to highlight here. I'm going to start. Look, their run defense was actually the biggest problem, and their front seven was the biggest problem on their team last year. And I don't think you could have added a better guy off the edge in the portal than BJ Green from Arizona State. I was watching him the other day as a pass rusher, especially. His hand usage, he's a little undersized, but I'll tell you what, he is probably he walks in as the best pass rusher in the Big 12. Not a lot of people know him. Arizona State only won 3 games last year, but this is a spectacular football player. And then a guy to get across from him from Pittsburgh and Deion Hayes, who I believe had 44 or 46 pressures last year at Pitt. It was a top 6 or 7 number in the ACC. They've suddenly got a really good pair of edge rushers that they can use to unleash on quarterbacks this season. And another guy, I'm going to kind of transition this to. So I went to Florida Atlantic, and, you know, there's not a whole lot to talk about lately with Florida Atlantic, but I'll tell you what, Colorado's getting their 2 best players from down there, and it's 2 brothers, the Wester brothers. First, I'll start with Jalen because I'm starting on the defensive side. He had the highest run defense grade for us last year of any linebacker in the country. This is going to be an impact player. He's got really good vision. He knows how to take angles, and I think he should start in this defense on early downs. I know they're moving Trevor Woods down to linebacker, and he's going to play a lot too, but to me, he's more of a coverage guy. You want an early down linebacker, you've got Jalen Wester, and then I'm going to transition to his brother real quick on the offensive side. This guy, LaJohntay Wester in the slot, carried FAU's offense for the last 2 years. And you might go, oh, well, it's FAU, whatever. He had, I believe it was the 11th highest receiving grade. Actually, no, the 11th most yards, I should say, in the country. And he was a top 20 receiving grade guy at FAU last year. He's a little undersized. He's a true slot guy, but he's legit. And he adds to a loaded group of wide receivers. I'm telling you right now, these 2 brothers from Florida Atlantic are going to be a big story for Colorado this year.
Yeah, I think especially the Wester brothers, those have been the most intriguing to me because I look at Colorado's linebacker group and That's like the one position group where I'm not the most confident in. I talked about them 2 days ago. I did my biggest concerns, and they were right at the top of the list because obviously a lot of stopping the run. It's on the front. They have to get pressure. They have to clog gaps, excuse me. But the linebackers have to get in there too. And Colorado's linebackers, if teams wanted to run the ball in Colorado last year at will, they did. Like there was no stopping them. And so Jalen West are a little undersized. So that's my biggest concern with him. You don't think that's an issue?
With him, no. I think it's more an issue to me when you talk about Trevor Woods moving down because he last year played at about 205, but Wester has really, really good instincts. And you watch him in games last year, took on Clemson and had a solid game. Turn on the Illinois tape when FAU went up there and played them. He was dominant. He was the best player on the field. And Illinois had 2 offensive linemen drafted. I think Wester is a guy who can work around that. His instincts and his vision are really, really good. And sometimes even FAU would have him come off the edge and use his speed off of the edge to work in the run game too. I think Wester is a guy who's used to it, who has enough instincts to adjust to that sort of thing. I would, regardless of size, I would play him on early downs at least a lot.
Okay, I like it because, sometimes you look at these linebackers and it's like you're looking for the prototypical 6'3", 6'4" type of guy, and he comes in 6 foot, and it's like, whoa, pump the brakes a little bit here. This guy's a little undersized. Okay, let's talk about some more transfer portal additions. I'll talk about a couple on the defensive line that I think stand out that haven't played a lot. Anquin Barnes, 6'5", 315 pounds. That's just a pure size sort of like excitement for me because Colorado last year, the biggest criticism on their team, or one of the biggest criticisms, was they're small. They are too small. And so they go out, get Anquin Barnes, who's ginormous from Alabama. They get Torian Carter from Arkansas, who's huge as well. And then they get Quincy Wiggins. Of those 3, which one do you think is going to have some sort of impact?
I think Carter helps a lot. I mean, you've got experience in the SEC, and I know it was kind of some rough times down there at Arkansas last year, but to have experience in the SEC type of environment against all those big offensive linemen he has to face, that's big time. And it is at a premium when you talk about there's a ton of good run games in the Big 12. This is a necessary thing. I think even a couple other guys that they added for their run defense, guy like Keaton Wade from Kentucky or Chidozie Nwankwo from Houston, they went out and clearly targeted really good run defenders. Obviously, they got Green and Hayes to rush the passer. That's big time too. But otherwise, in that front 7, this is an entire group of guys, and these are guys from the SEC like Carter and Wade. These are guys from other places in the Big 12. These are guys from rugged programs that play physical football, right? I think for me in the entire Big 12, not just Colorado, the premium is going to be on stopping the run. There are so many teams that can run the football. Oklahoma State, Kansas State, Texas Tech, UCF. I'm probably missing a couple because every time I run through a list of Big 12 running backs, they're just everywhere. It's such a stacked group when it comes to the running game, but that's going to be the biggest thing to me is in the Big 12, who steps up at quarterback. And there's only a couple guys that we know for a fact, and Colorado probably has one of them. And whose run defense can handle this gauntlet week in and week out, right? And I think it was a very targeted approach by Deion and the coaching staff to get a big depth of run defenders in there.
Yeah, the run game in the Big 12, I've been trying to tell people on my show. I went through a top 10 running backs rankings of the Big 12 specifically. Colorado played like 7 or 8 of them. Like they're going to go up against 7 or 8 of the top 10 running backs in the Big 12. So it's going to get a little difficult. Let's talk about the offense. We already talked about Wester. Let's talk about someone else who could stand out as sort of an impact or key player for Colorado. I would probably look towards the running backs for the biggest question at first because Colorado had no run game last year.
True. And you look at, I think what they tried to do here in a similar sense, I actually thought it was going to be the lack of running at the fault of the offensive line. And it was closer to maybe like below average, like kind of C. When I looked at it, I was surprised to see the backs, last year at Anthony Hankerson and Dylan Edwards, they had the worst rushing grade for us in the Power 5. And as a team, only 17 explosive runs all year, right? So they went out, I think, and they got more physical, right? Obviously, they're going to throw the ball. You have Shedeur. You have all these perimeter weapons. You want to throw the football. Dallin Hayden, and I think a sneaky guy, too, is Isaiah Augustave from Arkansas, who's a 230-pound physical back. These are 2 guys who haven't gotten a ton of work in their previous stops, but we've seen enough from them that I think what they want is that physical kind of counterpunch that comes off of the passing game, right? We have 2nd and 4, and we want to feel like we have a true 2-way go where we could hand it to Hayden or Augustave and run the football. I really like Hayden's vision. I think that's what jumped out to me the most from the limited time at Ohio State. There was a couple of really good games, especially in 2022. His vision jumps out at me. And August Stave, not the quickest guy, but I'll tell you what, to have a 230-pound hammer like that, I think the two of them are going to have a big impact. And I think it speaks to the theme that Deion wanted defensively and offensively in the transfer portal, is that we need to get more physical. We are good enough to win on the outside in the secondary, at receiver, at quarterback. But I think these two guys bring some attitude to the running back position they didn't have last year.
And they just make life easier for Shedeur. I think the game that stands out the most to me, when people ask me why Colorado was so bad at running the ball, I'm like, watch the UCLA game. They'd be running read options, and the defensive linemen were tackling Shedeur and the running back at the same time because they were just getting back there so quickly. So having new running backs that sort of can be physical, make some big plays with their legs, big deal. Also, we got to talk about the guys protecting them, blocking for them up front. I would say last year, if I had to guess, and you're probably going to tell me, Colorado's offensive line probably had the worst combined PFF grade, I would imagine, or at least up there. And then this year's class probably a lot better.
It should be a lot better. It was certainly well below average. I don't think it was all the way at the bottom, and I think in part that was protected. Sometimes it's protected in part because a guy like Shedeur Sanders gets rid of the ball so quickly. So if he gets rid of the ball in 1.8 seconds, we don't have as many chances to downgrade guys. But it's certainly, I'll agree with you. It wasn't good, right? And there's a reason they have 5 new starters in there. And this is another one. They attacked the portal, and this was the big recruiting story too, coming out of high school. Got the number 1 offensive tackle in the country, and Jordan Seaton at left tackle. There's no reason he shouldn't start immediately, right? So 2 guys that I'm looking at up front to make a big, big impact. One is Seaton. If he's that good, if he's the best freshman tackle in the country, let's go get him in there and produce. Another guy, this is a quieter one, Justin Mayers, a guard out of UTEP. And it sounds funny because it's UTEP and they're not known for a whole lot, but they're a really good pair of guards. Elijah Klein got drafted by the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, I believe in the 6th round of this year's draft. And Justin Mayers is just a really consistent player who could start to solidify the inside for this team. I think at the other 2 spots, we'll see which side Mayers plays on, but at center and at another guard spot and at right tackle, there might be a few more question marks, but those are 2 big names that I'm looking at. I think Justin Mayers could make a big impact on the inside, even though he's coming from a place like UTEP.
Yeah, I think, and I say this all the time, if this group can be average, just be average compared to last year's group, that's going to be a world different. I did 3 bold predictions on yesterday's episode, and one of them was that Shedeur Sanders was going to be sacked less than 30 times because he's averaging around, I think, he averages 55 because of last year, because you have, I think it was 32, 29-ish his second year. So if he's sacked, say, low 20s, maybe even in the teens, just imagine Shedeur Sanders with 40 extra plays to throw the ball. And that's pretty insane to think about just in terms of what you think he could do in terms of damage. I'm going to put you on the spot here. We know how good the receivers are. They have Wester. They have Will Shepherd from Vanderbilt, who's ginormous and produced at the SEC level. They have Jimmy Horn from last year, who's a holdover. Who do you think starts? We'll go 4 wide receivers. Who would you start for Colorado? Travis Hunter is playing offense in this scenario.
I think it's those 4 guys. And I think the one that I would question the most is probably Horn. I think Wester's an animal. I just think watching him at FAU the last 2 years, this guy's the best receiver in the country no one's ever heard of. So Colorado targets slot receivers more than any team in the country. LaJohntay Wester is going to get work. Travis Hunter's an animal if he plays. Will Shepherd adds a dimension at 6'3" and over 200 pounds that they didn't have last year. Horn's the one I would question the most, and I think the guy that I look to if he was going to get replaced is Amarion Miller. We had the spectacular second half against USC, and then for some reason we just didn't see him again. I remember watching the second half of that USC game, and I was like, where has this guy been, and why has he not been around more often?
I was like, is that Calvin Johnson out there?
for real. Just carving. And I know a lot of teams were carving up USC, but this was a freshman just going out there cold and carving this team up. And I was so curious why we didn't see him more last year, especially when we saw, Travis Hunter getting gassed a little bit and things like that. But Horn would be the one I question because you've got the movable piece in Hunter who could play inside or outside. And you could stick Miller right on the outside and then have Hunter in the slot like he was a pretty good amount last year. He kind of split time between inside and outside last year. But I think it's going to be those first four that you mentioned, but I think Miller's hanging around as a really nasty fifth option if they decide to use him this time around.
It's a great problem to have so many elite receivers. And then they also have Terrell Timmons from North Carolina State, who hasn't really done a lot, but I feel like he's flashed a little bit in his time there in North Carolina State. So very exciting team, I would say, for Colorado this year. When we come back, we're going to be talking about this same team. Are they contenders? Are they next level? Where do they sort of stand in the Big 12? But first, a word from our sponsors over at Game Time. This episode is brought to you by our sponsors over at Game Time. They have the best tickets for every event you need to go to, whether it's sports, comedy, theater, whatever it is near you. Went to a comedy show last night. I used Game Time, got the best deals available, and they have these really cool features. They have last-minute deals where you can save up to 60% off buying last minute for sports, comedy, theater, whatever it is, or you can even get zone deals, so you can save even more when you choose a section and let Game Time choose the seats for you. And the best part is they have seat views, so you shouldn't be behind a random pole. You shouldn't have these weird seats where you can't see anything, because you will be able to see everything from your seat on your phone. So take the guesswork out of buying MLB tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONCollege. That's LOCKEDON. COLLEGE for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. Welcome back to Locked On Buffs. It's me, Kevin Borba, and Dalton Wasserman of PFF. Dalton, we're talking about Colorado, and I think there's sort of this notion around them that they can't compete because they've been bad. They can't compete because they were subpar last year, right? But they've made a lot of changes. They've added a lot of experience. They've added a lot of talent. We just talked about it in the first segment. Where do you sort of see them in the hierarchy of the Big 12? Are they a mid Big 12 team, like mid-tier? Are they towards the top or towards the bottom? Because I think most preseason polls have them, there's 16 teams now. I think most preseason polls have them around 10, 11.
Yeah, I would have them higher than that. I think there are legitimately 8 or 9 teams in the Big 12 that could contend. It's a very wide open conference. There's some teams that lean more towards the top. I think Arizona is obviously really, really good. Oklahoma State was in the Big 12 title game last year. There's a lot of hype on Utah. I believe they're the betting favorite to win the conference, but I wouldn't have Colorado 10th or 11th. I think they have a lot of talent at the skill positions. They have elite talent, man. I mean, when you talk about Shedeur and Travis Hunter and BJ Green and some of the other guys that they have on this team, I don't think they're the 11th best team in the conference. I think they're better than that. They are certainly in the top. They're certainly in the top half. They're possibly in the top 5. And honestly, if they're better in the trenches than they were last year, I think they could contend. Look, when you have one of the 3 or 4 best quarterbacks in the country, you are supposed to contend for your conference title. You're supposed to contend for a playoff spot, right? In a 12-team playoff. I think they very well could. They have to execute better in the trenches. It's a fact. If this offensive line gels, Colorado may be the biggest X factor in the conference, because we know between Shedeur, I would say, and Noah Fafita, these are pretty clearly the 2 best quarterbacks in the Big 12. And that's a huge advantage to have. If you have one of the 2 best quarterbacks in your conference, you're at a massive, massive advantage over everybody else, regardless of some of your other flaws, right? So I think there's certainly if I was making a group of 8 or 9 teams, which I think there are, that would contend for a Big 12 title, Colorado's absolutely in that mix.
Okay, so Colorado's in that mix. So let's say it's October, it's November. I feel like that's when things start really getting intense in the Big 12 championship race. For Colorado to sort of stay in that mix, because obviously their schedule, for those don't know, I'll read it to you real quick. North Dakota State, at Nebraska, at Colorado State. They host Baylor. They travel to UCF that's their first 5 games. Bye week, Kansas State, at Arizona. And this is October. Kansas State, Arizona, who are both probably going to be top 25 teams. Cincinnati's kind of I would say a week off, but in the Big 12, there's really no weeks off. Then they have a bye week again. Then they finish with Texas Tech, Utah, Kansas, Oklahoma State. So in that October to November range, what do you think an ideal sort of, I guess, couple weeks looks like? Because that's when it comes down to their season. Like, that's what their season comes down to, in my opinion. How they finish in those last we'll call it 6 games or 7 games. How they do in those? I think they have to go to contend at least 5-2, and that's a tough draw right there.
Well, I think your ideal goal for the season really is to go 10-2, right? Last year, if you had a 12-team playoff, there's only one team, I believe it was Oklahoma, that won 10 games and would have missed the playoffs. So 10 games, I think, is really your hard cutoff. Maybe you could argue a 9-3 through that stretch. I think the biggest thing, it's going to be more of a feel thing than an actual record thing or which teams. There's going to be a ton of the tie-breaking scenarios and all of that stuff in the Big 12.
It's going to be a disaster.
It's going to be a disaster. It's so wide open. It's going to come into play. The bigger thing for me, those last four that you mentioned, I think it was Texas Tech, Oklahoma State, Kansas, and one other one, is going Oklahoma State, going into those last four. We're going to know how it's going to go by how good their run defense is. If their run defense through 8 games looks like a solid unit and they fixed it, and all these D linemen and Jalen Wester and some of these guys, like they come in and solidify this run defense, that's the key to beating all of those teams, even a Texas Tech. I think Colorado's better than Texas Tech. But Texas Tech has Taj Brooks, who could ruin your night. Absolutely. Even an earlier season game like UCF, we had UCF as the number 2 running back unit in the country when we did top 10 units. Oof. That's a dangerous, dangerous team to be playing. Even if you think all around Colorado's better, when you have teams that can run the ball and control the game, and obviously I don't have to mention what Oklahoma State and what Ollie Gordon can do. I mean, you're talking about the best back in the country. Right. That's what it's going to come down to for me. The record and the exact number of wins and losses, we'll probably get into scenarios and college football playoff rankings as we get there. To me, it's more, especially it was UCF and who right after it?
UCF, and then they have Kansas State and Arizona right after them. After the bye.
I think they can absolutely play with Arizona. They played a tight game with Arizona last year because that's a similar style of Pac-12 spread out ball. UCF and Kansas State are 2 big-time run games. When both teams have big-time backs, they got running quarterbacks. We're going to know, I think, in those 2 games how the rest of Colorado's season is going to go. If they hold up in run defense and they find a way to win one or both of those games, the hype is going to get off the rails. Because to me, again, the key for any team in this Big 12, but especially Colorado with how bad it was last year, is their run defense. The number of stacked – I'm going to be honest with you. I don't even think their first game is a pushover. North Dakota State is really good, second place in the FCS again last year, and they've got a big offensive line and can always run the ball. We're going to know right away what Colorado looks like and their run defense being an X factor for the rest of their season. And then it gets to that last 4 games, and you go, okay, now you're here. Now you have to run the gauntlet, right? Taj Brooks, Ollie Gordon, Devin Neal's a great back from Kansas. That's what it's going to come down to on top of protecting Shedeur.
Yeah, the run defense was a huge issue last year. I think I noticed it. I'm not even lying to you, Dalton. Week 1 at TCU, I said on my show, I was like, if TCU chose to run the ball, they would have won that game by double figures because for some reason they kept having Chandler Morris try to test Travis Hunter and it wasn't working. But I was like, every time they handed it off to Trey Sanders, it was an automatic 6 to 10 yards. And then they stopped doing it. And it's like, I was like, it was a great win. I'm not trying to be the Debbie Downer here, but I was like, that was a very concerning performance from the run defense. But you look at this year's, we'll call it front 7 compared to last year's front 7. There's probably maybe 2 holdovers, I would say. Like Levante Bentley is going to be back starting. Trevor Woods will be back. You can maybe make an argument for Shane Cokes just because he's a leader. He was one of the guys that had the patches on his jersey. But realistically, Colorado is going to be trotting out a whole new whole new defensive line. They have Nikhai Hill-Green at linebacker from Charlotte in Michigan, who I think he brings a sense of leadership and sort of just playmaking that they didn't have at linebacker last year. So if this group is able to get things done and you still have the guys from last year sort of fill in as reserves, that's pretty promising. I think last year they just put a lot of guys in compromising situations.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And look, and they were really, really small, right? Even the second half of the year, they were so short on linebackers. They moved Trevor Woods down, and he's 205 pounds. So you just saw, I think what you really just saw isn't so much the fault of Deion or any of that, right? I think he can't fix everything in one off season, right? And the front 7 is the one part he couldn't fix last year. But again, I have to love how much they targeted that in this year's portal cycle, and just directly, there was a clear purpose behind every guy they brought in the portal. And for a lot of them, it was exactly that, is fixing the run defense.
Yeah, this year's portal class to last year's portal class, we talked about it multiple times already. World's different. I say it all the time. Last year's portal class was, hey, I just want new players that weren't here on this 111 team. This year's portal class was, hey, I want to contend. I want to sort of make some noise because we all know it. I talked about it yesterday when I was talking about the odds of Deion Sanders being fired. He doesn't have too long to sort of figure things out in Colorado just because of how famous he is. If things go bad this year, he's going to be put on the hot seat heading into year 3. Like, that's just how it's going to roll for him. But he knows what he's doing. He knows sort of what he's looking for in a portal guy now, I think we would assume. And so their portal class is very exciting. I think Colorado's contenders, very exciting, realistically. And before we move on, can you just talk about, you talked about already, there's 8 to 9 teams that can contend in the Big 12. What does that look like in the sense of Colorado? Like, that doesn't mean they have to go undefeated. Like, it just means they have to beat certain teams certain weeks, right?
Yeah, I think in a highly competitive Big 12, I think 10 wins is the goal, right? I think for any of these teams. And you talk about certain games are going to be massive. I think especially you talk about Kansas State, Arizona, Oklahoma State, who was in the big, they always find themselves in contention, right? Kansas, if Jalen Daniels is healthy all year, has got a really, really good offense and one of the best quarterbacks in the conference. You do have some really big head-to-head matchups, and we're certainly going to be previewing a lot of those games because they're just such big games. But yeah, no, I mean, win 10 games, win the 10 right games, don't lose the wrong games, right? Don't lose that first one in North Dakota State, right? And even to be honest, out of conference, the Nebraska game is going to be massive. It's going to be a really good game. I'm expecting big things out of them too. So that's going to be even more fun than it was last year. It's going to feel like Colorado's playing a big game every week though.
It really is. And I like the point that you made there that they can't lose to North Dakota State. That's a standalone Thursday night game. So everyone in the country is going to be watching. And while social media shouldn't matter, it's going to matter when you're getting clowned by millions of people. Nebraska rivalry game at Colorado State rivalry game. Don't want to lose that one. They have some like personal beef with the Norvell family as the game gets closer. And then not losing the games in the Big 12 that they shouldn't. I look at Baylor. I look at Cincinnati. I look at even a game like Texas Tech, right, where it's like you can't afford to lose on the games where you might be favored or it's going to be really close because then it makes everything else that much more difficult. When we come back, we're going to be talking about how many wins are Shedeur Sanders and Travis Hunter worth. Are they Heisman contenders? We're going to be talking about all that up next on Locked on Buffs. Welcome back to Locked on Buffs. I appreciate you guys for tuning in every single day, making me your first listen of the day. We are free and available wherever you get your podcasts. We all love free things, and we all love some Deion Sanders and Colorado football. But who we love more has to be Shedeur Sanders and Travis Hunter. They are arguably the most dynamic duo in college football. They are arguably the most, I would say, intriguing duo in college football. I think there's a lot of people dialed into everything that they do. So, Dalton, talk to me about one. How many wins do you think they're worth? Like these two as individuals, how many wins do you think they could get Colorado over? Like say, last year they were at 4, right? And Travis Hunter was out for a few games. Shedeur was banged up at the end of the year. If they're healthy and playing well, do you think Shedeur and Travis playing well is like 5 to 6 wins, 7 to 8? Let me know what you think first, before we dive into Heisman chatter.
Just the two of them themselves. I mean, I almost, it's half kidding, but I almost want to say they're worth all of the wins, right? For this team, they're worth all of them, right? Like, because we talk about Shedeur like he's a top 3 quarterback returning to college football, right? And Travis Hunter is arguably the single most talented football player in the game. I mean, my co-host Max Chadwick calls him the Shohei Ohtani of college football.
Ooh, I like that.
Right? Like it's the receiver, the corner thing. Even we haven't seen this since a Deion or a Charles Woodson. It's such a unique situation with Hunter. But I'll start with Sanders. His quarterback is obviously so much easier to quantify than everything Travis Hunter does. They just need to protect him, man. And the physical tools don't jump out at you. He's 6'1". He's got a B to B plus arm. He's got decent, but not like Lamar Jackson mobility. But for me, what I was impressed with, you mentioned that TCU game, immediately was his ability to process coverages and make quick decisions. And I think everybody goes, well, Shedeur's the big personality. He's doing the rapping and Deion's his dad and all this stuff. But I go, no, this guy knows football, man. He came up with an elite pedigree. He sees defenses like an NFL quarterback would, right? And that's his biggest attribute. That very well could get him drafted in the top 20, in the top 10 of the draft, right? It's his ability to see coverages and make quick decisions. He just needs to be protected. Now, some of the sacks that you mentioned earlier and pressures are created from himself. He's trying to do a little bit too much, carry a team that was struggling and all that stuff. But when he's in a clean pocket for us, he had the 3rd best grade in the country
Mhm.
The only two guys ahead of him were Caleb Williams and Jaden Daniels, who went 1-2 in the draft. So
pretty good quarterbacks there.
Pretty darn good guys who are going to be stars for a long time, right? And it's just shown over and over when Shedeur is clean, he sees the field, he processes like an NFL quarterback. He makes quick decisions. He gets the ball where it needs to go accurately. He does all the things you ask for in a quarterback, right? As far as his throwing, because I think he still only threw, 3 interceptions last year. He doesn't put the ball in danger at all, even through all those hard times. He might take too many sacks, but there's a lot of coaches that have said, rather have you take a sack than throw the ball into traffic, right? They just ran out of gas, and they ran out of things to work with last year in the trenches. If this offensive line is significantly improved, I would expect Shedeur to contend for a Heisman. I would, because he's just in a clean pocket, because that's really what it's about. You get in a clean pocket, you make the quarterback his own variable. You take all the pressure and any of the noise around him out of it. And when that's been the case, Shedeur's been elite, right? You just have to make him clean more often. I don't have a whole lot of holes to poke in Shedeur's game itself, right? They just need to be better in the trenches around him. As far as Hunter goes, he's just a freak. It's hard to describe when you talk about if he didn't take that cheap shot against Colorado State, he would have somewhere around 85 catches and 1,100 yards last year as a receiver, and probably something like 2 or 3 more interceptions. You could argue, had he played the entire season last year, I don't know if he would have beat Jaden Daniels, because I love Jaden Daniels, and he was the best player in the country for the Heisman. But if he has a season like that this year, you're really talking about Travis Hunter. You could see both of them in New York. If everything goes best case scenario for Colorado, they could have 2 guys going to New York for the Heisman ceremony. I don't know which one would win it. It would depend on the numbers and everything else going on. But you could really, really see, wow, these are like the 2 best players in the country, which is insane to think about for a team that, they won 4 games last year, but that's how much potential there is in Boulder right now.
Yeah, the potential's through the roof. And like you talk about having 2 Heisman finalists, I don't think Colorado fans ever really expected that. And I kind of did something about Shedeur's Heisman hopes and sort of what he needs to do, because obviously we think of the Heisman as a quarterback award these days. Dating, I think, back to 2013, there's only been 2 non-quarterbacks, and they both happen to be Alabama guys. And every quarterback, this was sort of my benchmark for fans to sort of see if Shedeur is on track. Every quarterback through that time span, 2013 till last year, they've either had 4,000 touchdowns. That'd be an insane season. 4,000 yards, 40 touchdowns. And if they didn't have those marks, they had like 20 rushing touchdowns, which is Lamar Jackson, I think Marcus Mariota, and maybe Johnny Manziel was one of those guys as well. But Shedeur Sanders has the potential to throw for 4,000 yards, 40 touchdowns. And then Travis Hunter, while he's not an Alabama guy, because obviously those are the only 2 guys that we've seen win the award, he just brings a different element that we haven't seen. I think the best 2-way player, at least that I remember over the past sort of decade, was either Adoree Jackson or Miles Jack. And neither of those guys were like full-time like Travis Hunter. And so he really brings a new element to this team. And if you're Colorado, what do you like? Advice for Colorado fans here, Dalton? How do you appreciate this duo for one final ride? Like how do you just appreciate this year?
Hopefully you appreciate it because they're winning and they're in playoff contention, right? But no, I think you're seeing one with Travis, just an absolutely freakish talent. Like those 2 guys you just mentioned were really good players, but even Adoree Jackson only played receiver like a bit, like kind of a real part-time thing at USC, sometimes some gadget stuff. Like this is not something we have seen. Let's put it this way. Travis last year missed the better part of 4 games and still led the nation in snaps played. It makes no sense. When I saw in the Stanford game, I believe he played something like 157 snaps. Is that what I had down? It was somewhere around 160.
Right.
It was a lot. That's inhuman. Guys get to 80 or 90 in their shot, and he's out here playing 160 and playing both ways and having to cover. I know it went kind of rough in the second half, having to cover a guy in like Alec Eilmaner, who's one of the best receivers in the country. What they ask him to do is off the charts, which is the part where I hope, you asked the receiver question before. They've got those 4 guys, and they've got a Marion Miller, but I would think there's some rest maybe to be had on offense if they can block, if they can run the ball. If I've got this big breadth of receivers, I've got Will Shepard and Wester and all these guys, maybe I don't need Hunter out there every snap on offense. Maybe I just need him for the key ones. Or, maybe we can appreciate just if he's that good and he's just an alien, then so be it. That's what you get to watch at your home games every week, which is crazy.
Yeah, I was actually that was my next question was how do you manage Travis Hunter? And I think you answered it perfectly. They have elite receivers, and while I personally think his future is at receiver, and I personally would, if I was him, I'd probably want to play receiver just because there's more money, more longevity, and stuff like that. That's been my stance on Travis Hunter, and I think they kind of need him more on defense, not because their secondary is bad. I just think you have him, you have DJ McKinney, you have Preston Hodge, and those are three really good, almost great corners. And it's like, why wouldn't you want to keep that pass defense as stingy as possible, if you will? So, very exciting season for Colorado and Shedeur Sanders and Travis Hunter. Dalton, before you go, give me like your perfect scenario for Shedeur and Travis and then Colorado as a whole. Like, is it them in New York and Colorado wins or is contending for the Big 12 or in the Big 12 title game? What is your perfect scenario for Colorado?
Yeah, I think if you're talking upper band, like, wow, this is actually the story of college football, I think you're talking probably something like 10-2, right? And competing, you get to 10-2, and we'll see how the Big 12 title game goes. And you're on that border. If you win it, you're a top 4 seed. And if you lose it, maybe you're on the border, depending how things went and your losses and whatever. And there's a lot of factors in this 12-team playoff that are going to be fun. Certainly, you mentioned 4,000 yards and a bunch of touchdowns for Shedeur. What's going to happen here, and it's not the flashy stuff, and Shedeur and Travis and those guys are going to get all the headlines. But the difference in this team is going to be O-line, D-line. Okay, games are won and lost in the trenches, and these are things. Those are the things. I know Travis Hunter's great. We know Shedeur Sanders is great. I know the two FAU guys are great, right? But anyway, it's going to be that. Those are the things I'm going to be looking at, even when they play North Dakota State. When I'm looking at grades and breaking things down, O-line, D-line, run D, run block, the gritty things that aren't going to make the papers and that are only going to be talked about on shows like ours. That's what's going to be the difference in their season. On the skill players alone, I do believe they're going to win 7 or 8 games, right? Okay. I really do. There's just too much talent. Like, there's not many teams with their receiving corps. You mentioned all the corners. Preston Hodge was a fantastic player at Liberty. He's one of the best slot corners in the country. And even Shiloh, man, we haven't mentioned Shiloh Sanders. He's a good player there on the back end. Like, they've got a well-rounded secondary. They have a ton of skill talent and a really good quarterback. Those teams usually, that's why last year was so like, wow, they really got to fix the trenches. Teams with great skill players, even without the trench stuff, still win 7-8 games. Or I look at like a Kansas who won 9 games last year because they just have really good skill players and play calling. That 7 wins should be the floor for this team. I really believe that. They should not win just 4 games again. But yeah, no, the ceiling is conference contention, playoff contention, possibly 2 guys in New York. We'll see maybe if it's just 1 or how the voters want to go about that. But all of that stuff is on the table. But it's going to start week to week with playing better in the trenches. And there's going to be a boatload of teams testing that in the Big 12, especially their front 7.
Whew, that's a lot of excitement. A lot of things to be excited about, Dalton. I appreciate you for hopping on. I appreciate you for taking the time. Tell the people where they can find you, what you're working on before we head out.
Absolutely. So right now we're the PFF College Football Show, myself and Max Chadwick, and Max does a great job researching everything, breaking everything down, and we just get in there and have conversations. But PFF College Football Show on YouTube. We also have our written team previews we combined on for every Power 5 team. Plus, we're about to do 10 Group of 5 teams for teams that want to know for people that want to know the playoff contenders down in the Group of 5. That's all on our website with a PFF Plus subscription. There's other articles that are free. Those are behind the paywall. But right now, I forget through the date. I think it's the end of August. If you use the code CFB25, you'll get 25% off a PFF Plus subscription to see all of the stats I was talking about today. And as we get into the season, we'll have game previews, 5 or 6 game previews of the biggest games of the year every single week, including probably a lot of Colorado games. So if you want to see the visuals, on top of we have fantasy tools and betting tools and all that stuff, CFB25 to get 25% off PFF Plus.
Yeah, go check it out. They have a lot of great data. They have a lot of great analysis there. Dalton and Max, those guys are grinding all the time, and we appreciate them and we love their work. I appreciate you guys for tuning in to Locked On Buffs, making me your first listen of the day. We're free and available wherever you get your podcasts. Make sure to like, subscribe, follow, share this with a friend, and I will see you guys tomorrow.